Former American President Barack Obama has delivered the Annual Nelson Mandela Lecture in Johannesburg. Around 9,000 people, including President Cyril Ramaphosa, were in attendance. The lecture forms part of the centenary celebrations of the country's first democratically elected president. Mandela would have turned 100 years old this week. During his speech, Obama warned against leaders who undermine democracy.
I am not being alarmist, I am simply stating the facts. Look around. Strongman politics are ascendant suddenly, whereby elections and some pretense of democracy are maintained, the form of it, but those in power seek to undermine every institution or norm that gives democracy meaning. In the West, you've got far-right parties that oftentimes are based not just on platforms of protectionism and closed borders, but also on barely hidden racial nationalism.
Well, let's go live now to Johannesburg, where CGTN's Valdi Karlse is standing by for more on the Nelson Mandela Lecture. Valdi, this is one of the most high-profile appearances Barack Obama has made since leaving office. Just talk us through what kind of reception he got today in South Africa and the response to his speech.
Well, Lindy, I'm not sure if it was a little bit of Obama mania or some of that Madiba magic that you and I are so familiar with, but certainly a very warm reception here at the Wanderers Stadium in Johannesburg. As you said, thousands attended the Nelson Mandela Lecture, the biggest crowd the foundation says they've ever had for this lecture, whether that's attributed to the fact that this is his favorite Obama's first major public appearance since he left office, or whether that's attributed to the fact that this year is Nelson Mandela's centenary celebrations year. It's a year focused on really what the foundation calls urging people to, quote, be the legacy, to live out the values embodied by Mandela. Now, that's something that Obama said he still believes in, and that is, of course, equality, justice, freedom, and a multiracial democracy. As you heard there, he warned against the gains. He warned, saying that the gains made since Mandela's release from prison, the economic and democratic gains, are slowly being eroded. And he warned against countries closing their borders to immigration and to refugees, saying that can only lead to the collapse of the country. And what was a thinly veiled critique on the current political climate in the United States, he also touched, of course, on racial tensions, but he ended his lecture on a very positive note, urging the youth to keep believing, to keep marching, saying that every generation has the ability to change the world they find themselves in.
And indeed, as you suggested there, Obama's speech certainly resonated around the world with issues that are relevant as far as global geopolitics are concerned. But when it comes to the Mandela centenary celebrations, what significance do they bear for the rest of the world outside of South Africa?
Well, Linda, you'll know that celebrations are planned for the rest of the year, and they won't just necessarily focus on Mandela's birthday, which is tomorrow. It's International Mandela Day, declared so by the United Nations back in 2009. 2010 was the first time we were urged to give 67 minutes of our time to make the world a little bit of a better place. That's, of course, the 67 years that Mandela spent for fighting for social justice. There's actually another lecture underway at the moment being addressed by Professor Patrick Lumumba, a renowned African scholar and Kenyan lawyer. That's taking place in Mandela's home province in the Eastern Cape at the Walter Sisulu University. There are, of course, art exhibitions. There are sporting matches being played. It's right across the world. It's not just focused in South Africa, and it's not just focused on the continent. Also at the United Nations, there are some very high-profile events, and it will all culminate in this concert that will be here in South Africa in December, that will be addressed by the likes of Oprah Winfrey, Beyonce will, of course, give a performance. But that's all to to raise awareness about being a global citizen, about making this world a better place, about fighting for the freedom that Mandela embodied and believed in and worked for.
And indeed, Mandela, as you say, a global icon, but of course, a son of the South African soil, the man that was the face of reconciliation when South Africa transitioned from apartheid to democracy. But 24 years since him becoming president in 1994, does the Mandela name still unify South Africa?
Now, that's a great question, Lindy, and it's something that the Nelson Mandela Foundation Chief Executive Sello Hatang touched on today. Just before Obama gave his address, he said that, you know, Mandela always urged people to have difficult conversations. He said if two people are sitting around a table and they agree on something, that's a chat. That is not a conversation. And what the foundation has found engaging with people across South Africa as well as the continent is that people are casting doubts about those compromises made for freedom in South Africa. This negotiated settlement is what we call it, and the youth of today have been quite critical of it. And those are some of the criticisms that the foundation have received from the young people, those who have been born into freedom, who don't know about the struggle for democracy that Mandela and other icons like him had to endure. But Hatang saying that this is something that we must embrace, not only an opportunity to teach the youth about where we come from, but for us to learn from the young people about where we should be going, that there were maybe things that they could have done differently and should have done differently. And these are some of the difficult conversations we're having in the post-democratic era about Mandela's legacy. Just what exactly does he embody for young people who are the so-called born frees, no longer caught up in the euphoria of the anti-apartheid struggle and Mandela's rainbow nation, as he liked to call it, but instead to critically engage with his legacy, to see the kind of values that he embodied and to live those kind of values, particularly during his centenary year, Lindy.
Indeed, indeed. And as Mandela often said, it is in your hands, passing on the mantle to the next generation. Thanks so much, Valdi Carlson, joining us there live in Johannesburg.